This is our only duet if we were to think of this as a concert of talks. We're thrilled today to welcome Dr. Claudia Mitchell and Dr. Prudence Caladerou-Bessette. Claudia Mitchell is a distinguished James McGill Professor in the Faculty of Education at McGill University, where she's Director of the Institute for Human Development and Wellbeing and founder and Director of the Participatory Cultures Lab, a CFI-funded unit dedicated to training, research, and community activism through participatory visual methods. She has a PhD from the University of Alberta, a master's degree from Mount Sinai Vincent University, and an undergraduate degree from Brandon University in Brandon, Manitoba, Canada, close to where she was born. Her research focuses on participatory visual and arts-based approaches to working with young people and communities in relation to addressing critical social issues such as gender equality, gender-based violence. The idea of voice has been very significant to her work and central to two funded projects she's currently leading, focusing on girl-led, from the ground up policy dialogues to address sexual violence. One is a SSHRC partnership grant focused on working with Indigenous girls in Canada and South Africa. The other is a women and gender equity funded study as part of its program Gender-Based Violence, promising practices to support survivors and their families. Dr. Mitchell has been working on girls' education for 25 years and in a wide range of country contexts in West Africa, Southern and Eastern Africa, East Asia, Pacific, and Russia. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow, a 2016 winner of the SSHRC Gold Medal for the impact of her work, and the winner of 2019's Léon Gérène Prix de Québec laureate. She's also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the award-winning Girlhood Studies and Interdisciplinary Journal. She's currently editing a collection, The Lives of Girls and Women in the Time of COVID-19. She's published extensively about the lives of girls and women and has significantly advanced participatory, arts-based, and visual methodologies. Dr. Mitchell, it's an honor to have you with us today. Dr. Prudence Caladerou-Bessette is a clinical psychologist and postdoctoral fellow at McGill University, both at the Participatory Cultures Lab with the Institute for Human Development and Wellbeing and the University Institute Sherpa with CIUS de Centre-Ouest de Montréal. She's an associate professor of humanistic psychology at Université de Québec and Montréal. She works with children and families in different settings, such as clinical research and community spaces, and including the public health system. She gives priority in working with families with vulnerable life situations. Namely, she works with psychosocially and economically disadvantaged families, migrant, refugee, and asylum-seeking families, as well as Indigenous families. Her postdoctoral research project titled Including Children in Transcultural Mental Health Research aims to develop methods to listen to children in different contexts, such as youth mental health services in the public system or in temporary shelters for asylum-seeking families. This project is supervised at McGill by Dr. Claudia Mitchell and by Dr. Lucie Nadeau of the Department of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry. One of the objectives of this project is to allow the inclusion of children that can be a bit more difficult to reach in mental health research because of their age or life situation, and at the same time to offer them activities that open spaces for expression and play, which can have a positive effect both in terms of development and prevention. Claudia and Prudence's talk today is titled, Whose Voice Is It Anyway? Welcome, Claudia and Prudence.
Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, I guess it is. Still afternoon in Montreal. So welcome everyone. I'm the Claudia of the duo. Maybe to just start off, to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. McGill is, that's where we are both, although I'm not sure where we are both at the same time. And to thank our organizers for this wonderful invitation to participate this afternoon and to participate in all of the sessions. They have been just quite remarkable in taking an area of voice, along with agency and empowerment, I think are the three sort of like the triangle of areas that are so interesting and so important and so contested. And so it's a pleasure to be here and to be on the same screen as Linda Liebenberg. I spent the morning working on with Linda. She doesn't know because I've been reading your work and trying to develop something on participatory data analysis. So it's just so delightful to have heard you right now, and also know that I've been carrying you around in my head all day. So it's really, really lovely. What we would like to do, and we as Gail has mentioned, we're a duo. So we hope this will work. Prudence and I have not actually seen each other physically since February when we first started talking about this. So the slides are being controlled by Prudence, and I'm down the street. So we hope that it will all come together. When we practiced, it did, but who knows? So thank you very much, and we'll hope you will bear with us. We use the term. We started out with this rather not quite yet. This rather hackneyed term in a way, or very popular. Whose voice is it anyway? It's used in many, many different contexts. But we thought it perfectly described what we wanted to talk about today in relation to our work, our shared work around art, the arts, and creative expression. And we feel that in this work, multiple voices, and the idea of multiple voices is absolutely critical. And of course, feeding or following from Linda, thinking about youth voices, I think one of the things that we're very interested in is when we think about whose voice, when, where, how, and how do we negotiate that? And how do we look at this in a sense as a type of dialogue? So our presentation today really comes out of a dialogue between those working in clinical settings, and it very much relates to our paper, our article in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. And Lucy Nadeau, who is part of this process, and Prudence work in clinical settings. Prudence collected the data that we're going to be talking about today before she started her postdoctoral work with me and with Lucy. And I guess I come at this work somewhat as a person working in participatory arts-based research, and very much, I think, influenced by art itself. And so I know we can talk it forever about arts-based and arts-informed and the many different frameworks, but I see myself as maybe coming somewhere in these intersections. And so we start with this diagram that kind of looks at our shared interests, our intersections of the arts, whether it's film, performance, dance, photography, in a very big way, but that work informing arts-based methods of photography, drawing, digital storytelling, the work that Linda was just talking about. And then, for me, a new area, but that Prudence will talk at length about, the idea of creative expression activities. And I have to tell you that this chart has changed about 6 times before we got here this afternoon as to whether it's art activity or how do we call this. And so I'm very grateful to Prudence in our dialogue of convincing me it's creative expression activities that we're thinking about and how to bring these together. This is our shared interest. We differ in terms of where we come from, and my work is not typically in clinical settings. It's much more in research and community-based social action settings. And I think, and Prudence's work is much more in a clinical context. And so we have different lenses that we bring to this, and why we do this work, and why we might interpret it a particular way. But what is shared? And this is the piece that I think beyond this, whether it's the arts or arts-based or creative expression, is what we share today is what we call a critical convergence, is the belief in the importance of acknowledging where adults, older adults, as I'm now learning from this series, as researchers, as clinicians, as teachers, where we come into this. And although I know there's a vast body of work that we think about, how do we name this positionality, and how do we make sure, how do we not pretend that we're in there? And I think that that's one of our concerns, is that regardless of whether we acknowledge our position, we are there. And I think the questions that were just asked of Linda about where does the researcher fit, or whose voice is there, is something that we really want to take up. This, of course, is a very privileged position to think about in relation to where are we and who are we. And in some ways, I hate to take up the space of where does the researcher fit, because so much of the time we are the ones who are the privileged voice. We are the ones often giving the presentations, writing the articles for journals. And even when we try to subvert our position, that sometimes backfires on us. I know a forthcoming article in the journal Girlhood Studies that was written or was led by a group of girls, young women from Treaty 6, the Young Indigenous Women's Utopia group. And they write about going to a conference, the second annual conference of the Girlhood Studies in South Bend last year. And they write about being swarmed at the conference because they're the only young people, and that they're somewhat exoticized. And although their voices are there, their voices are somehow covered over because of their exotic presence. In another recent example, Nadine de Lange from South Africa has a chapter in a new book that is just has been edited by Lebo Moletsani and others, in which she writes about applying to go to a conference at a South African university with a group of young people with whom she co-authored an article, and they're going to present it. And the organizers said, well, no, we can't actually have young people at the conference. The irony was that the conference was on decolonization in the first place. And in the end, they decided not to go at all. But I only point out these examples because they're well-meaning and they intend to subvert the idea of the adult voice taking over. But the difficulties and the ways that we have to challenge these remain something that I think we have to really consider in this work about whose voice. So that's kind of where we're coming from. That's how our interests are in how do we look at the adult voice in arts-based, arts-informed creative expression activities. And I'll just move to the next slide now, Prudence. What we found difficult was how to systematically frame this work. There's lots of work that says, yes, well, what do we do with the voice of the researcher? What do we do with the voice of the adult? But what we've been very interested in working on, and this actually comes out of our paper that we published, or that's forthcoming in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, to kind of, I will use the word step back, Linda. We actually have an article called Stepping Back, but it's stepping back to reflect on. And we've been very interested in Gillian Rose's triangle of sites of meaning. Where is voice? And she writes, and she and John Fiske and others have written I think very appropriately about the idea of the image production, so that the young people we just heard about, producing drawings, producing cell films, producing photography. What do they say about their own work? How might they engage in participatory analysis? But the voice of youth, the voice of the child, the voice of the participant. Then there's the image itself, the drawing, the painting, the cell film, the digital story. When we were a few days ago at one of the previous sessions, we were talking about a drawing that just jumped out at a sociologist. So the drawing was there by itself in a way, regardless of who produced it. So there is an art piece or a creative piece. And then what we try to take up here is the Gillian Rose's notion of audiencing. How do we as researchers, as clinicians, as teachers, as professionals, how do we interact with the piece that has been produced? And it's an area. I think we'll just go to the next slide. So I mean, I probably everyone in the room who's ever done participatory visual research has as many of these kinds of images of people looking at the images. And some of them are implied. The one with the child drawing, we don't actually see the child, and we don't actually see the adult clinician who is working with that child, but there's kind of an implied audience there. The rest of the pieces are all about audiences. They're all images of people looking at looking, which is something that I've been very interested in for a long time. But the idea of what does that look like in terms of audience? How do we interact? And with art pieces, we have this vast body of work around art and art interpretation and looking at art. But what does it mean when we as adults look at art? And I have to say that this is the first time that I've been so involved in trying to think through how the adult in the directly is looking at this work, because much of my work, as you will see in these images, you might not be able to tell, but they're often policymakers, they're often communities, and I've been studying, well, how do you reach policymakers? How do you have policy dialogue? What are they doing when they're looking at these pictures? And I think for us, the question, or for me now, and as Prudence will take up, is how do we see ourselves in this audience that is it's a very specific audience in terms of advocacy, or in relation to a whole range of issues depending upon our positionality. So I guess it's really not only whose voice is this, but then fine-tuning that to where are we in the picture? And what happens when we try to make that more explicit? And how do we do that without taking over, but also how do we do that in a way that actually has an ethical practice to it in some way? So what we're going to do in the next little bit is Prudence, who has been working with a 9-year-old child, Max, is going to take us through some of the ways in which she, as in from her perspective, and the work she's been doing with Lucy, can put herself into that audience position. What does it mean? What are some of the ways that we think about interpretive processes? And then we will come back at the very end to think about, well, where are we going to go with this work? Because clearly we got started on something in this article that's taking us off in new directions around dialogue and audience. And so we are just inviting you to come along with us. And over to you, Prudence.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for including me in this presentation. Let me first apologize, everybody, that English is not my first language, so I hope you can still understand me well. And I hope this will all make sense. So I will talk about Max. That's a child that I met in research. But before I talk about Max, I will tell you a little about the context in which I met him, which is Lucy Nadeau's project. So it was a project on collaborative care in youth mental health. And one of the objectives we had in this project was to get in touch with the experience children can have of mental health services in CLSCs. So what is a CLSC? It's a community local service center. It's in Quebec. Those are kind of first-line clinics that are part of the public system, the public health system in Quebec. And many CLSCs provide youth mental health services. So we wanted to explore the experience of children in order to include their perspective into thinking about how to improve those services. So I have an experience of those services clinically, but this was another context. It was really a context of research where I met Max. So in this research context, we did 2 qualitative interviews for each participants. For each triad of participants, we met children, parents, one parent, and the mental health professional after 6 months and after 1 year of services. So for the children under 12, we used the talk, play, draw approach. And so we invited the children to talk a little about their experience, and then we invited them to express their experience by playing and drawing. So as you can see here in the image, we provided wood figurines and color papers to represent spaces. And we suggested something like, what if we would play the story of a child who goes to the CLSC? How would the story begin? How would the characters feel? How would it end? And we also provided white sheets and colored pencil and suggested something like, what if we would draw a child that goes to the CLSC? What would it look like? Excuse me. We also told the kids that the child in the play or in the drawing could be themselves, but it could also be imaginary characters if they wish to. So this approach that we can call symbolic or projective resembles how we can work in clinic. And this approach is meant to give as much freedom to the child as possible in order to facilitate emotional expression, make the child more comfortable, and allow for a more positive experience. And this symbolic approach can also make mental representations visible and allow the child to express wishes, but indirectly. In interviewing the children, we also used a non-directive approach inspired by the well-known humanist psychologist Carl Rogers, who developed the client-centered therapy. In short, being non-directive means to follow as much as possible the child. So we can do this by putting into words what we hear, and this is called a reflect, or by asking exploration questions to support the child into developing his or her voice. Of course, it's impossible to be completely non-directive, but the idea is to have a posture where it's us following the child and not the opposite. Okay, so now about Max. So Max is not his real name, of course, and details have been changed to ensure confidentiality. So I met Max and his mother at their house for the qualitative research interviews. So as I said, this was not a clinical context. I know from the mother and the mental health professional that Max was at the CLSC with his mom and his brother for family meetings. The mother requested services because Max had important behavior problems. For example, he could throw things around the house or run in the middle of the streets when there were cars passing by. He was also very aggressive and he had attention and sleeping difficulties. His parents were separated and in constant conflict. His mother was struggling as a parent emotionally and economically. Max's relation to his father was also difficult, and his father was at times suicidal. He agreed to the services, but he did not participate very much. In the interviews, Max told me that they went to the CLSC because his mom had a hard time and he couldn't sleep. But he said that the services helped, really helped. Then in the second interview, he said that yes, the service helped, but that it was okay that it had an end because he also wanted to be just like a normal kid. Max found it difficult to explain his experience at the CLSC, and that's where he said, oh, maybe you can ask my mom, she can explain. So I asked, for example, was there things that he liked or disliked? And he answered, oh, I really liked to play, but I didn't like to talk. So I figured that's what we would do. So in the first interview, Max made a story that you can see. So it's the image here, about a boy who feels angry all the time. And he was going to the CLSC with his mother to see a man who gives advice to his mother. And then the child gets older and becomes someone who helps and works at the CLSC. Then, here you can see, he made a drawing of himself sitting at the CLSC with his actual mental health professional. And they are smiling. In the second interview, Max told the story of a rude and misbehaved little girl, which corresponds to the image here. So in this story, the father, the school, the police, and the CLSC lady discussed together and agreed to lock the girl up alone in her house for 3 days and then send her to prison for 2 days. But at the end of the story, all her problems are solved. Then Max and I talked about the profession of the CLSC lady in the story. He explained that she was a mental doctor and that this kind of doctor can solve mental problems. Then we talked about whether or not there were similarities between the little girl in the story and him. And he said, "Oh, no, I'm not like the little girl. She has problems because her mother died. I have problems in my head." After the play, Max made a drawing of himself at the CLSC. So I will put it bigger so you can see. So he's sitting at a table with his mental health professional in the middle and him and his brother on either side. The mother is standing beside them and at a distance. You can see a smiley face on top of the mother's head, a question mark over Max, and the name of a football player over the brother's head. So now if we go back to the whole picture, how can we interpret these play and drawings? So there's infinite possibilities of interpretations that are possible, but just so we can have some things to think about, I'll just suggest a few and we can talk about the implications of that after. First, in talk 1 and play 1 and drawing 2, the needs of the mother appear to be central. And this corresponds to the reality as acknowledged by both the mother and the mental health professional in the interviews. So the needs of the mother appear central, while maybe Max might have wished for meetings to meet his own needs. Indeed, he draws himself alone with the mental health professional in the first drawing. And in fact, both the mother and the mental health professional also noticed Max developing a growing interest in the meetings when in the beginning he did not want to go. The play in interview 2 is probably the most difficult to interpret. So I think I won't say a lot about this one, but I think that an important part is the comment Max makes at the end of the interview when he says that he has problems in his head. And this can make us reflect on how children can internalize problems. And one might also wonder, when listening to Max, how children can feel in a culture where the lens of mental health is emphasized as a way to understand ourselves. The wish to be a normal kid could also be understood that way. But Max's productions also seem to talk about the trust children and the hope children can have in a mental health professional and in the mental health system. We can see that in the very positive representation of the mental health professional in the first play and the first drawing, and the fact that Max thinks that mental doctors can solve mental problems. Finally, in drawing 2, we can think that Max represented himself wondering why he's at the CLSC. Max did mention when we talked at the beginning of the interview that when he went to the CLSC, his mother did not honestly tell him where he was going and why, and that he would have liked to know the truth. So these interpretations I suggest, and also these results I present, are of course influenced by my own voice, because as Linda said, we always organize the data. So we have a voice in that. And so the interpretations I suggest are influenced by the fact that I'm a child psychologist, and by the fact that, and also by what I can hear as a person in looking at this material and in this relationship also with Max. So my interpretations are influenced by the kind of audience I am. So maybe we can ask the question of how we can be a good audience and how we can do good interpretations. And so regarding those questions, I think that what's important is to be in a dialogue So as Claudia said, we were in a dialogue together, but in working on this material, it was also a constant dialogue between different materials. So between the play, between the drawing, between listening to the interviews, to reading the verbatims, to looking at the drawings and the play over and over and over again. And also so it's like being in an interior dialogue and also a real dialogue and also a dialogue with the data. So we can never really know. I cannot know for sure if my interpretations are right, but we can also ask, as I said, what's a good interpretation? And I think this question has to be thought in relation to the context, which is today the context of you being an audience. Because in formulating these interpretations, I had you in mind, even if I don't know who you all are. Because maybe one of the things that we can do with our privileged position as adults is to carry the voice of children so they can be heard. And this can be difficult because our academic world can be far removed from the world and language of children that is made of play and images and relationships. And we need to be reflective of that also. So now, what are the implications of this work? We can think about that, and also with the questions maybe, and we will be back to Claudia.
Oh, thank you, Prudence. Yes, well, there's obviously in all of these presentations, there's so much more to say, but maybe what we can do is hint at where we are going with this work and why we think it's an angle that is important to take in this context of audience and whose voice. I think we've heard from across all of the presentations that people are really dealing with very different frameworks and often playing around with, well, what happens? I'm thinking of Brenda Gladstone's work. What happens when we look at metaphor? How does that help us think about something? So for us, coming back to our point about Gillian Rose's work on audience, I guess we ask, what difference does it make if we can insert ourselves into a body of work that tries to look at interpretation and audience? How does that help our work? I think I would also like to ask ultimately, what could people who are working outside of clinical practice and working outside of this work learn from the area of audience? So it's sort of like we want to not only learn from the work of visual theorists, but we also think about, well, how does this work? Working with a one-on-one setting in advocacy for a child, how does that also help us think about audiences in different contexts? So that's one area that we're working on. Clearly, the notion of positionality and reflexivity remains a constant here. Where are we as researchers in the picture? Where are we as clinicians when it comes to interpretation? We know that within social research, reflexivity and positionality have become key, but I think that we can really drill down in this work. And I want to mention a new book by two of my former doctoral students, Casey Burkholder and Jen Thompson, who have a new book out on field notes in social research, in education and social research. And I kind of see this as being something that reflexivity is discussed so much, but actually thinking about new tools for doing this and how other people do it. We're also working on a book with a group from Sweden and South Africa called Where Am I in the Picture, which is around researcher positionality. And how do we think about that? And also, how do we not overtake the child's voice? I think the question of ethical and an ethical interpretive process is something that we would like to really spend more time with. When listening to Prudence, you heard her kind of dilemmas on well, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but this is how I think, based on my experiences and what my responsibility has been as a clinician. So how do I think about that? And so I think ethical interpretive process is something that we can bring to our work with children. But I also think, going back to my first question, ethical interpretive process could be something that I think can inform other work around audience, and certainly thinking through the myriad studies around youth and policy making, and how can policymakers become part of this process of looking at the visual. Is there an ethical interpretive process that other stakeholders can have? I guess I would definitely advocate for, and Prudence and I have talked about this a lot in the last 24 hours, about multidisciplinary dialogue. I think we realized after we finished writing the article that there was so much more to say about, well, why do you think of that way? Or how did you come to think about that way, these issues that way? Because I haven't thought about that before. And I know within qualitative research, there are a couple of really groundbreaking studies of researchers talking to each other about how they make sense of work. And I'm particularly thinking of Janet Holland's groundbreaking work on sexuality, and how our team spent like days and weeks trying to talk about the data. Where are they coming from? Which might seem like a luxury, but at the same time, how do we do this ethically? Lynn Mickle-Brown and Carol Gilligan's work on the listening work that they did in the early 90s, I think, was also, again, researchers talking to each other, not leaving out the child, and again, thinking participatory data analysis, but also as researchers, what can we learn from each other, and the power of dialogue. And I guess the last point we want to raise is, how do we not lose the child's participation in this? And I hope that by asking the question, whose voice is this anyway, we haven't suggested that children aren't there. As a community, that is why we do the work that we do. I think we're all very used to being criticized for tokenism, ventriloquism, power differentials, and all of these pieces that are critique of what does it mean to work ethically with children. But what I think we pose as just a question to put out there is, how do we continue to do this better and not do it at all? Because I think that's where we are absolutely committed. So that's the end of our presentation. I know we were a little longer, and we had a lot to say, and there were two of us. So I hope that we have put out some questions. And here are our details. We'd love to hear more from people. And clearly, this is a long-term project. Especially since Prudence has at least one more year as a postdoctoral candidate, our postdoctoral fellow. We have a lot to do, so thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Wow, you definitely gave us lots to think about. And I think that although we didn't necessarily know it ahead of time, yours was a perfect talk for the last in the series, because you've put out quite a number of challenges to our audience and to all of us, not least of which is the challenge to continue moving the work forward, as you say, rather than stepping back because of potentially being intimidated by the challenges involved. How do we find ways to talk to each other, learn from each other, and keep the work moving forward, which is, of course, the key aim of this symposium series and of the project itself. So I'm going to shift to a couple of questions, beginning with a very big question, but one you can break down a little bit between the two of you, perhaps. So what would you see as the specific challenges of power, consent, and confidentiality in this work?
I'm going to turn it right over to Prudence, because I know she has like an answer to start us off with. So
I think that maybe we have complementary answers, but I think that what we can say about that is that what's important to say is that play and drawing are actually a way that we can reverse those power issues that we have between adult and children. So when we allow children to to play, they're in the position where they can decide what they want to do, what they're comfortable to do. And the more freedom we give them in that, the more power they have. And I think it's the same for, we can say something like that also for consent and confidentiality. Because for example, with Max, sometimes when he was playing, his mother was there. So the fact that he was allowed to play characters was a way for him to choose a way to say something without without putting himself in a position where he could be criticized by his mother, for example. So it's an example. And also for consent, it's a way that the children have a space to choose what they consent to do or not.
I would just maybe add in there, and I obviously would have had a different answer pre-COVID-19, but so much of the work that I've been doing around, which is sensitive issues around gender violence, really had to think differently about what kind of position children and young people are in when they're often answering in the presence of their parents. And of course, as Prudence says, this happened anyway. She was interviewing the child in his home, and his mother was there and was commenting. But I think that the way Prudence really put out the creative part of this, like it might not be about you. Do you want to tell a story about someone else? I think is a piece that gives a lot of freedom, and I'm seeing that as something like, how do we actually continue to do work? It could be online, it could be through WhatsApp with families, but not still staying in touch, and maybe still learning from, but giving that space to be much more creative, telling the story. So I don't, it's like, I feel like maybe I'm being sort of like opportunistic to take on this in the context of COVID-19, but it has been such a pressing issue as we've been reviewing literature around the world, that I think that what you've done, Prudence, in this work has really helped us see this notion of creativity, and it's not just about you and your story. I mean, obviously the child story, and obviously in photography and other formats that also gives license to be more creative. But I think that you've really opened up a space to think about this in the context of confidentiality, and in the context of news sites that aren't in an office somewhere, but they're in someone's home. I don't think I have more to say on that.
That's okay. Thanks. That's great. It reminds me also of, I know that you both will be familiar with debates about whether there is, in fact, such a thing as methods specific to children when it comes to generating qualitative data. And of course, techniques like using vignettes or using comics, there's a few others, probably many more, that were actually initially developed for use in research with adults. So arguably, some of the things that you've talked about today could equally be applied to research with adults, where there are just other different considerations about what people feel comfortable to say, what remains unsaid, what's between the lines, and what might be credited to someone else, what a different person or a character in a vignette might do or act, as opposed to taking a direct ownership of that. I think you've mentioned a couple of times, even in the talk itself, how we might think about this notion of trying to keep the perspective or the voice of the child front and center, and how do we think about whether or not we ourselves as researchers are kind of taking over. So you have spoken about that a bit. I wonder if you just want to expand a little bit on your thoughts about that, especially in the writing process, how we present that work when we publish.
Yeah, one of the things that Prudence and I have talked about a lot is actually this very point of the writing process, and how you keep going back to the child. And it might be that you're working with the drawings in front of you, or you're listening to a recording. But how to keep that child ever present in your mind. And we've talked a little bit too about how, in a way, by the time you're writing about the child, if you're not doing this in this participatory way that Linda spoke about, and you have to disguise, or you change the child's name, you change many circumstances, because you want to respect confidentiality, but and anonymity, but how to hang on to the real child who is there as well. And I think that going back over again, listening over and over again, the discussion, I think that is a very important part of this. Working as teams as opposed to working by oneself as much as possible is, I think, an added part of that. And I don't know, Prudence, what would you add to that, or come off on a different tangent perhaps?
I think that keeping the child in mind is really important. I think that the part where we're always asking ourselves, or having the posture of humility to think that we might always be a little wrong, and going back to the data, to the material, and because I think it's like some kind of puzzle. And when we do that puzzle, it's a puzzle that we do. So it's our voice organizing it, as I said, but we have to have the child in mind. So it's a puzzle that has to represent the child that we met. So even in preparing this presentation, I don't know how many times I went back to the interviews and to the drawings, because I was wondering, oh, did he really say that, or is it really true to say it like this? Or because we always transform the data, we have to transform it so it's understandable. But in doing this, it has to remain true to a certain limit. And so this process where we try to keep it true is with keeping the child in mind, I think.
Maybe I would add into that too. I was thinking of Joseph Tobin's work on working with children, and I think his book has a lovely title, like the cool guys are the ones with the hats. And his point is that any two lines that a child might say, or any two lines that anyone might say, has the potential for such richness, and it's our job, or it's our responsibility to try to unravel that. And I think he uses the example of how many books, how many utterances have we had of to be or not to be? That is the question. And people have many philosophers and linguists and literary theorists have puzzled this. And he just says, well, could we do the same thing with two lines from Max in the same way? So I think it's that kind of unraveling. And obviously this doesn't translate into necessarily, if you have to have a report on someone tomorrow on something in a clinical setting, maybe. But at the same time, it also, I think, really causes us to realize that we need to do a lot more. We could do a lot more with less too. That we often collect a lot more data when we actually need to sit with work in a more unraveling and trying to appreciate the full complexity of something too. I always make things worse and muddy.
Well, I really agree. I think certainly there are hazards to trying to think about a particular truth, and it's more helpful often to think about the notion of multiple truths, and certainly multiple various interpretations that are always possible. And as you say, this is one of the great benefits of interdisciplinary work, where we can really take that time to listen and learn from each other, depending on, who is the group of analysts present. And as in Linda's work, it included the young people who were part of the research. going to just shift to some of the comments and questions we have from the audience today. Katie Ma, who presented last week, or sorry, on Tuesday this week, says, thank you so much for sharing these insights. I'm very much looking forward to reading your paper. I draw on rows in my work, and so have given much thought to participants' intended audience, as well as their unintended audiences their voices might reach, and of course the effect of their voices on these audiences. The idea of thinking of researchers as audience is intriguing, and likely a fruitful way to think of reflexivity and positionality. Can you please speak to how thinking about the researcher as audience might play out in analysis or impact analysis?
Yeah, okay. Well, I always have lots to say about policymakers and as audience. I'm working with several of my doctoral students right now who've been looking at policymakers going to exhibitions and not looking at pictures, but doing what politicians sometimes do. They're kind of like out there, here I am, but are also being very critical, like, oh, that's not right. That child shouldn't have done that. Or I think I've written about that in a previous article for the International Journal of Qualitative Methods on, a principal of a college saying, oh, that girl she should have just cleaned up the mess that's in the picture instead of taking the picture and making it. So I think where I'm going with this is, I think that as I've looked at these very critical, adults who've been very critical of children's pictures, or question them, or did that really happen to them, or whatever, I think that's the part that I really want to take in and think, as researchers, why do we think this did happen or didn't happen? Or the sociologist we heard about the other day who said that was just such a moving piece. Like, I think in the same way that when we go to a film, or we go to a play, or we go to an art exhibition, or we see an art exhibition online now, that we really try to grapple with where we are in that. And I guess so. Again, I want to argue we shouldn't take over, but I also want to argue we shouldn't do this work if we don't want to confront some of our own demons or our own uncertainties. Why am I so uncomfortable with this picture? Or why do I keep showing this picture every time I do a presentation? The pictures I had earlier of audiences, part of the reason is that I have permission to use those ones, but I also, some of them are ones like, oh, I just have to see this picture. I just love showing this picture because I feel it does something. So I guess in terms of emotion, affect, I think our emerging theories on affect are really important. And I think maybe one of the best ways to study affect is to study our own affect in something. And I haven't done a lot of work with Sarah Ahmad's work and others, but I'm really interested in that notion. And I've wanted to think about it as other people, but it should be us. So I guess I would say that in some of this work where we're thinking about ourselves as audience, that in order to round out that picture of the triangle, that we need some pretty basic but also sophisticated ways to think of ourselves as audience, and what moves us and why. And I know at every presentation, sooner or later, I will say, Susan Sontag says photos haunt us, but why that one? So I guess I do want to take us back to that affect piece. And Prudence, I don't know if you want to jump in here, or.
Yeah, I don't remember what the question was again, but I had things to say, but I think that maybe, I don't know if it's related to the question, but it's different in clinic than in research. And I think that how we take over, so our positionality, I guess, is different in clinic than in research. And that there's something about the real child, or the real relationship that's really central in the clinic, and in the research it's different. There's something about the relationship that's really important in research, but at the same time there's this consideration for confidentiality, and in the end we also have to think of why we are doing this work. and who we want to tell it to. And so this is how, so I think that maybe in relation to what I said before, we have to think of the child, but maybe also of the child in the child. So meaning like not only this individual child, but what this child said is important for other children, and that is important that adults hear, or older persons.
Well, you know, that's actually a great link to another question from the audience. Megan has said, I'm interested in bringing young people's views into dialogue with policymakers. Can you speak a bit about this experience as much as you've had it, and what might be some of the ethical implications?
Oh my God.
With policy, like trying to bring the kind of work that you're doing into dialogue with policymakers, which I think is a challenge for many of us as researchers. We do the research often with a view to advancing some type of social change, but how can we bring that work into a conversation with policymakers?
Well, I have done some thinking. I don't know, do you want to start, Prudence, or do you want, you work with—
More of an expert on that question?
Well, I don't know if I'm an expert or I just keep doing it.
Maybe
I was thinking of the various stakeholders that you work with in health. So maybe we can come back to that. But I think there are some real ethical issues that need to be taken into consideration. And sometimes I've struggled with ethics boards about whether the participants will be allowed to present their work to policymakers or not, and whether it's dangerous. Or I'm thinking of one of my students is working on teen pregnancy, and although it's in the community where the girls are coming from, they're quite comfortable to be known as pregnant teenagers, but our ethics board says, oh no, this could put them into some sort of a position that could be very, very dangerous. Sometimes I don't want actually policymakers to, well, there's sort of like, there's two things. Sometimes it's really good. They should be there, the voice of young people, to explain their work or to be present. Some of the policymakers actually kind of scare me in some of the work that they were, if they would be about to dismiss something. I think that would be a very difficult position. So I would say know your audience. And I think Delgado and other people write about this in the context of photo voice, that it's kind of your responsibility as a researcher to make sure that you're not putting young people into a more dangerous position or a vulnerable position than they would otherwise have been. So it may require that you need to do something before the exhibition or before you bring people together. That it's not just that, oh, well, people made drawings, or they maybe the cell film, or they have these photos, and let's show them to everybody in the world. That I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and when it doesn't work, I think we have responsibility in there for that. So I could talk about this for like hundreds of days, I think. I don't mean, and only because in terms of the fraughtness and the benefits. So it's like both of those. So one part is truly to think about the ethical issues, the preparation for everyone, the engagement of everyone, and for young people to have the right to say, yes, I would like to have an exhibition, but I hope that it will not involve the priest from our church, because I don't want him to see these photos right now. So I think that there's some work that we need to think about in terms of how to make it not only a positive, but a productive discussions, as opposed to some things that could be actually very harmful to more to young people than to the stakeholders themselves. They probably can handle that, although our ethics boards are much more concerned now than they ever were with everybody being, we're aware of the triggering effects of something, and all people need to be protected in that work, but of course, especially children.
Thanks. Thank you, Claudia. I want to round us out with a final question, and it's from Brenda Gladstone, who also presented on Tuesday. Brenda asks, do you think as childhood researchers, we put an extra burden on ourselves for locating our role or our voice given that in fact researcher voice in this sense is part of all research, not just with children?
Oh, that's definitely Prudence. You have to answer that
Okay.
or start that if you want.
Maybe, but maybe it has to be that way.
So you're feeling that there is some greater responsibility in research with children than necessarily with other persons?
I think that the responsibility is central in research with children, but maybe it is in all kinds of research. But I think that there's maybe different responsibilities, or I don't know if it's more or just different, but there's the translating responsibility to try to organize what we heard into some so it can be heard also by the academic world and the policy world.
Do you want to add to that, Claudia?
Well, I would quote Prudence on this, because Prudence has, I think in some of the writing that you've done, you really talk, it's around that notion of language, I think. And so this is not only about children, but it might be around many contexts where language is an issue and a particular responsibility that we might say, well, this is what the child said. But the difficulty of putting into words what people want to say, and I'll put out people at the moment, but acknowledging that for very young children, there may be particular challenges in terms of what is the meaning and what meaning would they like to have. And so I think some of the non-directive techniques, see, Prudence, you convinced me of this, the non-directive techniques that you've been talking about kind of allow that to unfold more. And that is a responsibility. And I'm not suggesting that this isn't necessary with other populations, and certainly vulnerable populations. Gail, you talked the other day about children with disabilities, and where are some of the ways that we need to think about how to make sure that they're heard and their voices are not compromised in any way. But I think that there are particular responsibilities, and that maybe it's the vulnerability part of it that could transcend childhood, but certainly includes childhood.
Thanks for that. I do think that another place we can look to for some guidance might be thinking back to Dr. Carnevale's talk about this delicate balance around protecting children or other groups that might be seen as vulnerable or disadvantaged, and at the same time wanting to use our relative privilege in order to try to bring forward their views and perspectives and ensure that whatever it is the area that our research is focused, that their views very much inform the sorts of, again, today, policy questions, but could be programs, services, again, whatever it is that is the topic of our research. So I really want to thank you wholeheartedly for joining us today. Again, I know that many people have questions we've not had time to address today, but I hope that they will follow up with you, having shared your contact information.
Please do.
Yes, great. Thank you.